We continue asking the question, who is God and what is God like? I submit to you that grappling with this question is the most important, the most practical discipline of life. Every other dimension of living is affected by how we answer that question. Why? Because according to the Bible, we were created in the image and likeness of God, Genesis 1:26. That is, we were made to reflect the nature and character of God, which means we finally discover who we are when we discover who God is. Who is God and what is God like? The good news is that the living God has chosen to answer this question for himself, for only God can answer it. Only God can tell us who God is. Only God can tell us what God is like. And God's first major self-revelation is recorded in Exodus chapter 3. From within the burning bush, which did not burn up, we have the divine answer to the human question. Exodus 3, verses 1 through 10. Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. And God said, Do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He also said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I'm aware of their sufferings. So I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey. And now, behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come up to me, further with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore, come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. This revelatory event, which took place 3,500 years ago now, is surpassed in revelatory importance only by the events of Christmas, Good Friday, Easter, and Pentecost. Here God breaks a long silence. For 400 years, the Hebrew people could only recall how God had met their ancestors, how God had spoken to Abraham and Sarah and to Jacob and Rachel. At best, God's self-revelation was a memory. But here in the burning bush, God breaks the silence. On the slope of a mountain where God will speak again, the reality behind the word God pulls back the shroud of mystery and opens up to us. And everything God reveals from within the burning bush is more lived out in the events of the Exodus, of God freeing the Hebrews from captivity in Egypt and of God bringing them to the promised land. And everything God reveals that day is fleshed out, literally so, in Jesus of Nazareth. God's speech, God's word become flesh, John 1:14. Moses hears words which change his and our perception of everything. I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I have surely seen the affliction of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying because of their taskmasters. I know their suffering, so I have come down to deliver. God reveals four great truths about who God is and what God is like. Sees, hears, knows, comes down. The living God is the God who sees. That is something Moses and Israel could not have deduced from their circumstances. From the merely human perspective, no one saw their suffering. It remained hidden behind the glitter of Egypt's economic prosperity. No, says God. It has been seen. I have seen your misery. I have seen the way you've been afflicted. I see the economic exploitation and the political oppression. I see how you suffer. Nothing is hidden. There are no secrets. The living one sees it all. The suffering in the slums and the suffering in luxury condos. I have surely seen the misery of my people. You can therefore appreciate why the burning bush encounter is such encouragement to the people of the two-thirds world. In the 1980s, church leaders met in Bangkok for a great assembly, and they took this text as their primary text for the theme, Salvation Today. It was also held a central place in a meeting in Nairobi for its theme, Jesus Christ Frees and Unites. The living God sees what is happening in the world, sees what is happening in your world and in my world. The living God is the God who also hears. I have heard their cry because of their slave masters. Again, that is something Moses and the Israelites could never have deduced from their circumstances. From their perspective, their cries only reached the ceiling and dissipated into thin air. No one heard. No, says the living God, your cries have been heard. I have heard them. I have heard them. That raises the tough question, then why do we not seem to get an answer? But the fact is they are heard. All cries of humanity are heard. The living God hears the cries of fathers who cannot find work. The living God hears the cries of mothers who cannot feed their children. The living God hears the cries of men and women who want to be fathers and mothers but cannot. The living God hears the cries of fathers and mothers who do have jobs and who feed their children, but who are empty inside and who silent despair in the midst of their affluence. The cries of the human spirit are heard. God opens up even more in this encounter. The living God feels what is seen and heard. I know their suffering. The Hebrew word translated know is the word yada, Y-A-D-A. Yada involves a knowing that is more than cognitive. Yada is the same verb used to describe the intimate knowing between a husband and wife in sexual union. Yada involves an intimate knowledge that is cognitive and visceral, that is mental and emotional. I know their sufferings. I feel their sufferings. Moses discovers what he could never deduce. The living God is the God who suffers with the world. Now, this truth is what separates the Judeo-Christian God from all the gods of other faiths. 4 great attributes of God are affirmed by most religions. God is infinite. God is incomprehensible. God is indivisible. And God is impassible, or as the Greeks put it, apathetic, non-feeling. For the Greeks, God, if God is to be God, cannot be affected by something else. God cannot be moved by anything else. For in the Greek mind, that would imply God could be controlled by external reality. Therefore, God cannot experience emotions, whether pleasant or painful. God, therefore, cannot suffer. The divine one is impassible, apathetic, non-passionate, unfeeling. This is the view of God held by most religions and philosophies of life. Thus, for example, when a Muslim woman suffers, she suffers for Allah, but never with Allah. This view of God has also permeated the thinking of the Christian church. From the 2nd century until the late 19th century, the impassibility of God, the apathy of God, was a tenet of orthodoxy. The living one cannot be moved by realities of life and still be divine. Oh, the church theologians spoke of God loving the broken world, but that love was an attribute, not a feeling. The church theologians could not affirm God's capacity to feel with others because it implied that God could be controlled by reality outside God's self. Says Jorgen Moltmann, the German theologian who suffered the horrors of the Nazi concentration camp. The church theologians made the mistake of recognizing only two alternatives, either God's essential incapacity for suffering or God's being subject to suffering if God did suffer. Moltmann argues there's a third alternative, namely the voluntary laying oneself open to another and allowing oneself to be affected by the other. It's in his book, The Trinity and the Kingdom. At the burning bush, we discover what Israel and we could never, ever deduce. The living God chooses to be intimately affected by the reality of others. Whoa. God chooses to open God's self up to the pain of the world. The living God is infinite and is incomprehensible and indivisible, but not impassible, not apathetic. I know my people's suffering. I feel in my people. The Japanese scholar Kazuo Kitamori expresses this most boldly. After the Japanese believers had found some emotional distance from the dropping of the atomic bombs and could begin to reflect on that experience, Kitamura wrote this: God enfolds our broken reality. Our reality is utterly and hopelessly broken, and yet God embraces it all. The living God has taken up the pain of the world and made that pain God's own pain. The world's pain is now God's pain. What tremendous encouragement God's self-revelation brings. We're never alone in our suffering. And when our hearts break for the heartbreaking realities of our suffering world, we know that we're not alone in that. The very ground of being, the very source of life feels it all. Moses, I have seen the misery of my people. I've heard their cries. I know their suffering. I feel it. And then comes the real surprise of the burning bush encounter. The living God is the God who enters into the world. So, Moses, I have come down to rescue my people. What God sees and hears and feels moves God to come down. And in that coming down, to deliver from bondage and to rescue for relationship, both as corporate and as individual humans. I have come down. This turns out to be the central affirmation of the Christian view of God. The living one enters into the full orb of human existence. How? Well, according to Exodus 3, through the willing obedience of a human being. After God tells Moses, I've come down, God says, so you now go, Moses, to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. God enters into the world's crisis and acts on the world's behalf through a mediator, through a willing human being, an 80-year-old shepherd. Throughout history, God has continued to come down in this manner through representative humans. But all those coming downs point to the coming down. For one day, in Bethlehem of Judea, the living God did, in fact, in the most literal sense of the words, come down. And now becoming the human being who would willingly obey. And when God came down, God took the name Yeshua, Jesus, which means Yahweh is salvation, or more literally, Yahweh to the rescue. That is the living God.